In 1763, the idea of America as an independent nation was nothing but a distant dream, if it was dreamt at all. The land that would one day become the United States was, at that moment, a collection of 13 British colonies hugged by the Atlantic, with a population of 2.5 million men, women, and children who viewed themselves as proud, loyal subjects of the British Crown. They conducted their business in the fashion of the English, read newspapers printed with London news, toasted the king at colonial taverns, and considered British history their own. But within just 13 years, these same colonists would shock the world by declaring independence, breaking centuries-old ties, and taking up arms against their king. What could transform so many loyal subjects into rebellious revolutionaries? It is a question that has fascinated generations. The story of America's path to revolution is not just one of a political rupture, but of a gradual, often reluctant awakening. A decade marked by decisions, confrontations, and escalations, as ordinary people were swept along by the tides of history, from peaceful petition to defiant rebellion. The seeds of discontent were planted quite unceremoniously by war and wallets. In 1763, the British Empire stood triumphant after the brutal 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, emerging with vast new territories stretching past the Appalachians. Yet this victory was dearly bought. British coffers were emptied, and the government faced staggering debts that weighed as heavily as any battlefield loss. For King George III and his Parliament in London, the solution seemed self-evident. The colonies, who had so clearly benefited from British arms, ought to help pay for their own defense and the burdens of empire. Across the ocean, however, the mood was different. The colonists, many generations removed from English soil, enjoyed a remarkable degree of self-government in their colonial assemblies. They paid taxes levied by representatives they elected, just as their ancestors had done in the Old World. But they had no direct representatives in the Parliament across the sea. When the Stamp Act of 1765 was imposed, taxing all legal documents, newspapers, and playing cards, it was seen not simply as a financial imposition, but a fundamental violation of colonial rights as Englishmen. If Parliament could tax the colonies without their consent, what limit would there be to British control over American life? Resistance to the Stamp Act was swift and determined. Newspapers thundered with cries of liberty, and pamphlets circulated in every town. Merchants vowed to boycott British goods, and American consumers followed. In towns and cities, crowds gathered for public protests. Sometimes, their anger boiled over into intimidation of royal officials. Protesters formed groups calling themselves Sons of Liberty, organizing mass resistance and even threats against British tax collectors. Across the Atlantic, British merchants, feeling the weight of American boycotts, pressed Parliament for relief. In 1766, Parliament did repeal the Stamp Act, but in the same breath, they passed the Declaratory Act, insisting on their right to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The colonists' victory was real, but so too was the warning. Britain had no intention of ceding real authority. Just a year later, Parliament tried again, imposing the Townshend Acts in 1767. This time, duties were laid on imported glass, lead, paint, paper, and especially tea. To enforce compliance, royal officials were empowered to seize suspected smuggled goods and even enter private homes with writs of assistance. American merchants and consumers again responded with widespread non-importation pacts. Boycotts once more emptied British warehouses of colonial orders. The push and pull of resistance and reaction grew more tense and more personal. Seeking to quell the unrest, Britain sent an occupying force of redcoats to the restive city of Boston. Their presence, constant and conspicuous, raised tensions further among the tightly packed population. On a wintry day in March of 1770, a confrontation between townspeople and soldiers boiled over. Insults hurled, snowballs thrown, then chaos. Shots rang out. By the time order was restored, 5 colonists lay dead or dying in the snow. What happened on that grim night? immortalized in Paul Revere's stirring but exaggerated engraving as the Boston Massacre, spread fury and fear throughout the colonies. Under increasing pressure from merchants back home and a restive colonial public, Parliament chose to compromise. The Townshend duties were mostly repealed, but, symbolically, the tax on tea remained. Now, tea became a battleground for principle as well as profit. It was more than just a drink. Tea was the centerpiece of colonial social life, a ritual in homes grand and humble alike. Anger simmered. In parlors and taverns, the question was asked, if Parliament can tax our tea, what can't it tax? In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, a measure designed to rescue the East India Company from financial collapse by giving it a virtual monopoly on tea sales in America and lowering the price of tea. But colonial merchants heard a deeper threat. If Britain could favor one company over others and bypass established colonial trade networks, who would be next? Was this the thin end of the wedge that would end all colonial free enterprise? Defiance reached a dramatic zenith on a cold December night in Boston. Colonists, some disguised as Mohawk Indians, silently boarded East India Company ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the Black Harbor waters. Their message was as bold as it was unmistakable. No taxation without representation, no commercial monopolies without protest. King George III and Parliament were incensed. Their response, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, went far beyond the immediate matter of the tea. Boston Harbor was closed, its commerce strangled until compensation was paid. Massachusetts's cherished self-government was revoked. British soldiers could now be quartered in colonial homes, and certain royal officials accused of crimes would be tried not in America but in faraway England. It was a turning point. The acts were meant to punish Massachusetts, but across the colonies they prompted a surge of outrage and solidarity. If such punishments could be meted out to one colony, what could stop them being applied to all? For the first time, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia in the First Continental Congress, declaring the Intolerable Acts null and void, coordinating colonial resistance, and pledging to meet again if the crisis deepened. Even as they professed loyalty to the king, the path toward confrontation was narrowing fast. Meanwhile, the reality of armed conflict drew nearer. Colonists began drilling in town greens, stockpiling weapons and powder. Spy networks fanned the countryside, alert for possible British moves. General Thomas Gage, commander of British forces in Boston, received secret orders to seize colonial military stores at Concord and to arrest rebel leaders. On a chill April night in 1775, riders galloped through the darkness, Paul Revere among them, spreading the alarm. "The regulars are coming!" At dawn on Lexington Green, 70 or so local militiamen faced a line of British redcoats. Ordered to disperse, they hesitated. No one wanted to be the spark that ignited war. Suddenly, a shot rang out. No one knows who fired it, but its echo set the world ablaze. In moments, blood was shed. British marchers encountered even larger resistance in Concord, and as they retreated back to Boston, the countryside rose in arms. By sunset, nearly 300 British and colonial soldiers had fallen. The American Revolution, what had seemed unimaginable just months before, was underway. In May, leaders meeting in the Second Continental Congress appointed George Washington to lead the makeshift Continental Army. For much of the next year, the colonies fought while professing loyalty to the king, demanding not independence, but restoration of colonial rights. Yet as the war ground on, hearts and minds changed. A powerful voice sped the transformation. Thomas Paine's stirring pamphlet, Common Sense, appeared in early 1776, making the case for full independence clear, simple, and stirring. In every town and tavern, the arguments of Paine took root. His words, in the language of the people, made the idea of breaking from Britain not only thinkable, but necessary. Throughout the heated summer of 1776, the Continental Congress debated. On July 2nd, the vote came, independence. And 2 days later, on July 4th, they approved Thomas Jefferson's eloquent Declaration of Independence. Its words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," rang out in marketplaces and churches, and in the hearts of a people now committed to a new and uncertain future. But the fight was far from over. The war dragged on for nearly another 7 years, testing the endurance, spirit, and courage of the young nation. Thousands would pay the ultimate price. The revolution unleashed questions and struggles that would not be settled by victory alone. What rights are truly fundamental? How far can government's power extend? What does liberty really mean? In just 13 years, the journey from loyal colonists to revolutionary rebels was complete, a process marked by tension and escalation, by principle and by necessity. The legacy of those decisions and the meaning of that struggle echo down the generations. Each new era asks anew, how free should a people be? What sacrifices are freedom and self-government worth? The American Revolution may have begun over taxes, but it became a profound experiment in human freedom, one that continues to evolve.